Thank you. Hello, everybody, and may I say what a delight it is to be here, and I'd just like to thank Antonio for inviting me to come here. I was here 7 years ago and had a wonderful time, and I'm sure I'm going to enjoy this just as much. And now the apology. Like most Englishmen, I'm afraid I'm not very good at languages, so you're going to have to bear with me while I give my presentation in English. The Chicago Conference of 1944 is generally regarded as the turning point in the development of international civil aviation. But what exactly did it achieve? Did it bring to a close what has been referred to elsewhere as peaceful air warfare? Of the conference, its chairman, Adolf Burley, who was also Under-Secretary of State in the US State Department, after the conference he declared with great confidence, he said, "The International Conference on Civil Aviation has advanced civil flying by at least 20 years. In contrast, a senior Canadian delegate at the conference said, and I quote, "We have been in travail for a month and have brought forth a mouse." I'm not too sure what mouse is in Portuguese.
Everybody.
Okay, everybody did that. Okay. So who got it right? Why was the conference needed in the first place? What did the main players aim for, and what was in fact achieved? Was it indeed a mouse, or an historic systemic change in international civil aviation? Well, to try and answer those questions, I'm going to deliver my presentation in three parts. The first part, I'm going to try to identify some of the generic or the general problems of international civil aviation. Secondly, I'm going to try to illustrate how some of those problems played out in the interwar period in the attempts to develop transatlantic air routes. And then thirdly, I hope those two first parts of the paper will put us in a position where we can analyse and come to some informed judgment about what was actually achieved at the Chicago Conference. So first of all, the generic problems of international aviation. Civil aviation has operated at the interface of economics and politics ever since the formal establishment of national air sovereignty at the Paris Convention in 1919. And among other things, that logically led to cabotage, the reservation of domestic flights for a state's own national airlines. Sovereignty over a nation's airspace dictated that the operation of any international route between two states had to be agreed between the parties involved in what was usually a highly complex exchange of politically determined commercial rights. And the emphasis there is on political. Transit over and technical stop and refuelling rights in foreign states were sometimes denied or only granted at exorbitant financial and/or political costs. Such rights were, of course, particularly important in the interwar period, given the limited range of the aircraft. Furthermore, commercial aviation was compromised by aspects of security, national prestige, safety and public service factors. And at issue particularly for international services was therefore how to cut or at least loosen the Gordian knot that tied sovereignty to the airline industry. Until that was done, the marketplace would remain fragmented, the playing field competitively uneven, as airlines strove for political advantages, and governments supported and subsidised national airlines and restricted the operation of foreign companies. Strategic and defence considerations were always important when addressing the health and welfare of a country's civilian airline industry, but this was to become even more obvious during the approach to and the experience of the Second World War. Triumphs in the air and the more permeable they made frontiers brought a new poignancy to humanity's vulnerabilities as the tragedy of the 1930s unfolded and global war approached. And that explains why the future of civil aviation and collective and national security became linked and of such importance. Civilian and military aviation fed off each other, for example in research and development, and were inextricably entwined in national security. All this posed intractable problems in attempting to create an efficient commercial airline system that could exploit the opportunities offered by developments in technology. Without a new aviation regime, countries would be forced to continue after the Second World War with a vicious form of nationalistic bilateralism and the inadequate technical provisions of the Paris and the later Inter-American Havana Conference, respectively of 1919 and 1928. And these two conventions were not fully compatible, and they lacked universal reach. The only other significant international agreement on aviation was the 1929 Warsaw Convention, dealing with documents of carriage and carrier liability. In other words, the international infrastructure as it stood during the Second World War was completely inadequate to enable the civil aviation potential that existed to be realised, except in a most dysfunctional fashion. So, much needed to be done, and the challenge was huge. But before we go to look at how those challenges were dealt with at Chicago, let me try and illustrate in a little bit more detail the kinds of generic problems I've just sketched out for you by looking at attempts to develop transatlantic air routes in the 1930s. So, transatlantic crossings. The jewel in the crown for international aviation was, and still is, transatlantic routes. The 1930s brought forward a variety of proposals and projects for transatlantic aviation, which ranged from a joint Anglo-French United States scheme to exclusive collusion between Pan-American World Airways and Imperial Airways. And by the way, it's not British Imperial Airways, it's just Imperial Airways. The whole international aviation system, if one could distinguish it as such, was confusing and complex, partly at least because Pan American World Airways boss Juan Trippe and Britain's Imperial Airways general manager Woods Humphreys worked closely and often secretly together, developing policies and negotiating independently of their governments. Between Trippe and Woods Humphrey, there developed an understanding that together their two airlines should dominate the Atlantic on the basis of what they referred to as a square deal. But these secret agreements between Woods Humphreys and Trippe did not always remain secret and came to be frowned on by governments, which eventually insisted on more say and more involvement. As planning for transatlantic air routes developed, particularly from December 1935 onwards, when British officials arrived in Washington for discussions, it became evident that the interests and objectives of Pan American and the US government were not in entire accord. Unlike the US government, Pan American, Imperial, and the British government wanted to exclude competition from the Atlantic by restricting operations between Britain and the US to Pan American and Imperial Airways. The British would also exclude airlines of other European countries from servicing the Atlantic by denying them landing rights on both the northern and southern routes in Newfoundland and Bermuda respectively. In other words, the British held an important card here. They could stop anybody at this time from operating across the transatlantic by denying them refueling rights in Bermuda on the southern route and in Newfoundland on the northern route. As a senior British official put it in December 1935, I quote, "We feel that this cannot be a matter that can be left to any, shall we say, chance company that comes along. we must ensure that we get the best possible operating instruments that will give us both efficiency, economy, and safety. End of quote. And that, so far as that British government official was concerned, meant that Imperial Airways and Pan American World Airways would have a monopoly on transatlantic routes. However, to exclude other US airlines from the transatlantic became a problem in Washington, where the government was not keen on that idea. However, in the end, in the 1930s, there was an understanding that looked to provide a 15-year permit to Imperial Airways and Pan American for each to operate twice weekly between the US and the UK, via Canada, Newfoundland and Ireland on a northern route, and from the US via Bermuda and other country stops to the UK on a southern route. The other stops on the southern route essentially meant refuelling in the Azores and going on to landfall somewhere in southern Europe. But neither Pan Am nor Imperial Airways held such rights in the Azores in 1935. In principle, there was supposedly no exclusivity, and also the understandings were based upon the principle of full reciprocity between the countries interested. They do not operate to exclude similar arrangements between the United States and other countries. It was hoped that experimental flights could take place in 1936, with the full service being inaugurated simultaneously, and that's important because this agreement was for the launching of simultaneous services by both Imperial and Pan Am at the same time, and they hoped that they would be able to do that in 1937. But that timetable turned out to be unduly optimistic. In fact, the idea that the Atlantic should be open to all airlines of all nationalities was an ill-disguised fiction. In April 1937, Pan Am signed an agreement with Portugal for access to the Azores to the exclusion of all other US airlines. Imperial Airways was not long behind in gaining landing rights in the Azores as well. The two companies looked all set to monopolise Atlantic crossings. But in fact, events and technological drawbacks in the UK now impacted on Imperial's and Pan Am's plans to launch their operations simultaneously. With prospects of war looming in Europe, British rearmament requirements forced the British government to concentrate on military aircraft, and Britain was thus unable to develop equipment for transatlantic civil operations. In the US, the situation was very different. There, the United States had developed the formidable aircraft, the Boeing 314. The crucial thing about the 314 was that it could fly non-stop from the United States, bypassing Bermuda on the southern route and stopping in the Azores for refueling before going on to Europe. In other words, Britain lost its veto power over American airlines because they could now bypass the British base of Bermuda and fly straight to the Azores and then on to Europe. In a very strong sense, the British had been outmanoeuvred by the development of American technology. At this point, London, now also looking to the future, realising that war was likely to come and that Britain would need help from the United States, taking all those kind of political considerations into account, the British government thought it would be wise to agree to allow Pan American to start the transatlantic route unilaterally without Imperial being able to launch a service as well. TRIP and Pan Am did so until the outbreak of war ended normal operations. But Pan Am was already running into political difficulties in Washington. In fact, TRIP had had to relinquish his monopoly rights on the Azores as a kind of condition for him being granted rights by the US government to launch the service. The concern in Washington was already developing that they didn't really want Pan American Airways to monopolize American overseas operations. And because of that, Tripp had to relinquish this agreement that he'd struck with Portugal for exclusive American access to the Azores. That was a sign of things to come, because already there were developing considerations in Washington about the future of international civil aviation. And as the war progressed, those discussions intensified, and they eventually led to the Chicago Conference in 1944. So now I'm going to come to the Chicago Conference. I've tried to describe some of the generic problems of aviation. I've tried to put those in a more specific context by looking at the political problems that arose in the development of transatlantic operations. And now I'm going to see how all this came together at the Chicago Conference. Chicago was primarily the American government's attempt to rid the international aviation system of the obstacles placed in the way of commercial operations by company maneuverings and political and security interests, which had so complicated and restricted civil aviation in the interwar period. And we've seen how that played out in the way that Imperial and Pan Am tried to develop routes on the Atlantic. The Chicago Conference is in many ways the story of what became known as the Five Freedoms, or the Five Rights. The so-called Five Freedoms were actually composed by the Canadians, but they were used very much by the Americans. And the Five Freedoms, or let's just call them the Five Freedoms of the air, are as follows. Freedom 1 was the right for innocent passage over a foreign country. Freedom 2 was the right to stop, to refuel, or for technical reasons, for repairs, in a foreign country, but without entering into any commercial transactions. Freedoms 3, 4, and 5 were the three freedoms that defined how commercial operations were developed. Freedom 3 was the right to pick up passengers from an airline's country of origin and disembark them in a territory of another contracting party. Freedom 4 was the right to pick up passengers in the other contracting party and disembark them in the airline's country of origin. And Freedom 5, the most controversial of the freedoms, was the right to pick up passengers from the other contracting party and carry them forward to a third-party destination. And it is on the basis of these five freedoms that the world civil aviation system eventually evolved in the post-war period. But only the first two freedoms were actually agreed to and implemented by the Chicago Conference. Why that is so is crucial to the understanding of what really went on at Chicago. I would contend that there are two key issues which determined the outcomes of the Chicago Conference. The first issue was differences between Britain on the one hand and the United States on the other. The second key dynamic that determined outcomes was differences within the United States administration itself. It's the second one that has been much neglected by historians. And if there's anything original in my paper this afternoon, it's teasing out the consequences of the differences that existed within the US administration and indeed within the US delegation to the Chicago Conference. So let's look at these two key factors in turn. First of all, the differences between the British and the Americans, because these were the two key players at Chicago. In fact, most of the Chicago Conference took part between direct negotiations between the British and the Americans, with the Canadians trying to play a kind of an intermediary role. Okay, well, first of all, as noted already, the British lagged behind the United States in passenger aircraft technology in the 1930s. And that was exacerbated because of an agreed wartime division of labour, whereby the Americans were to concentrate on the production of large transport planes. Britain made virtually no transport planes during the Second World War. We abandoned that area of technology to concentrate on night bombers and fighters. The Americans, with far more resources, covered more or less the whole range of different types of aircraft, but they were specifically given the job of developing large transport aircraft, the type from which you can develop large passenger aircraft. So the British liked modern equipment, and the British were fearful that such lack of equipment would lead to US domination of post-war international aviation. That's what the British feared. Their goal, therefore, was to agree to some kind of liberalisation of the industry. They didn't want to replay the interwar period either. So they wanted some liberalisation, but a liberalisation that would be safeguarded by rigid international controls that would keep for Britain a substantial portion of the international aviation market. As well as this weakness that the British had, namely lack of equipment, they had a major strength. They had control or political influence over half the globe because of the empire and client states. And Britain was thus in a position to deny access and routes to the United States over half the world. You have to remember, in international aviation, no country can play the game alone. You have to get into a cooperative venture with other states for international aviation to work. There always had to be willing partners. In contrast, the United States had the equipment. They refused to countenance a strong international regulator, and they also insisted on a more open and competitive system. However, just how competitive has been, I think, over-exaggerated by many historians. For example, no senior US official ever proposed free pricing, competitive pricing. All senior American officials wanted some kinds of pricing controls. They were not keen on the idea of a free market. The United States was in a very powerful position. It had a huge array of levers and powers to get what it wanted. It had advanced equipment. It had economic influence. It had the ability to deny other countries economic assistance. And of course, Britain needed economic assistance at the end of the war. And the United States also had huge prestige, as it was now the undisputed premier power in the world. The US used these powers and levers to help push through acceptance of freedoms 1 and 2. And these rights, or these freedoms, were not much resisted even by Britain. So, freedoms 1 and 2, transit and technical stop, were agreed to at Chicago. It's known as the Air Transit Agreement, and is probably the most important substantial achievement of Chicago. Let me rephrase that. It is the most substantial achievement of Chicago. And the United States in particular benefited from this because freedoms 1 and 2 were prerequisites for opening up the world to US airline penetration. No longer would signatories to the Air Transit Agreement be able to deny transit and refueling to American airlines. That was a prerequisite. If you couldn't get that, then you could not commercially exploit the world. So this was a very important agreement. But the story of freedoms 3, 4, and 5 the freedoms that would craft the commercial environment, agreement could not be reached at Chicago, or at least it could not be reached by enough countries to make the agreement viable. According to the conventional wisdom, the Chicago Conference failed to reach accord on rules for commercial operations because of a dispute between Britain and the United States over fifth freedom rights. Fifth freedom rights is the right of one country to fly to another, pick up passengers there, and take them on to a third-party destination. The nub of the issue was the extent to which the United States Airlines, passing through the United Kingdom and onto Europe or elsewhere around the world, could pick up passengers in Britain. The British were fearful that if they granted unlimited fifth freedom rights to the American airlines would eat into what the British regarded as their regional market. And they would eat into the British regional market in such a way that British airlines would become financially unviable. In other words, instead of travelling between London and Paris on a British airline, passengers would travel on the most modern equipment owned by American airlines, who flew into London and went on to Paris, offering competitive rates that the British airlines could not match, and on equipment that the British could not match either. So the British insisted that there had to be tight restrictions on the American right to pick up passengers in Britain for third-party destinations. The result was impasse. Now, this was no small matter. You have to realise that people viewed the future of international aviation as comparable to what merchant shipping had done to the world in the 19th century. So this was of great significance, so much so that when the impasse emerges at Chicago, both President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, become involved. And if you look at the exchanges they had, and there were several, and they were lengthy, those exchanges are some of the most, if not the most, venomous and acerbic exchanges, ill-tempered, between Churchill and Roosevelt of their entire correspondence during the war, which stretches to hundreds and hundreds of telegrams over some extremely sensitive issues. But none, I would suggest, that became as sensitive as their exchanges over civil aviation. Despite that, despite the involvement of Churchill and Roosevelt, the impasse remained. It could not be broken. An agreement on a commercial regime for international aviation was not reached at Chicago. That's the conventional explanation of why Chicago failed to get commercial agreement. But this conventional wisdom is seriously wrong, or at least incomplete. I would say seriously wrong. The fact is that key personnel within the US delegation did not want an agreement at Chicago on the lines of an automatic exchange of 5 freedoms, because they feared that in the medium to long term that would threaten the viability of US airlines. Now, I don't want to get too technical here, but it's important that you grasp this fact, or what's going on here, and what the difference is. If an agreement had been made at Chicago on the basis of acceptance of the 5 freedoms, then all signatories to the agreement, their airlines would have the right automatically to operate into the United States. The United States would lose control over foreign airlines operating into the United States. All signatories to such an agreement would have a right to operate into the US. In other words, this was a multilateral agreement. Now, what I'm arguing is that there were certain very influential people within the US administration who never wanted a multilateral agreement on the 5 freedoms. Instead, they wanted to have bilateral agreements. In other words, they would negotiate state by state, and they would choose, the Americans would choose, which state they wanted to have a Five Freedoms Agreement with. And that would allow them to protect the future of American airlines, because some American officials feared for the future of American airlines. Now that might seem a bit surprising, given the dominance at the end of the war, but these people were very forward-thinking, and they realised the dangers. And let me now try and illustrate that. So it's a battle between trying to get a multilateral Five Freedom Agreement, or do it on a bilateral state-by-state basis. I'm going to obviously try and simplify the whole thing, and I'm going to present this tussle within the American administration as between two people. Of course, it's much more complicated than that, but in order to try to get my argument across, I want to present it in terms of a disagreement between President Franklin Roosevelt on the one hand, and on the other, Welch Pogue, who was the chairman of the US Civil Aeronautics Board. And some of the information I have to share with you about Welch Pogue's position, I gathered through an interview that I did with Welch Pogue back in 2002. At that time, he was 100 years old, but still very sprightly and certainly compos mentis. In fact, so compos mentis that he actually drove me across Washington in rush hour. I closed my eyes for the first 5 minutes, but he was fine. The first US official civil aviation planning report by a committee chaired and much influenced by Pogue put the matter thus in March 1943. Okay, so we're talking a good 18 months or so before Chicago. I quote, "As time goes on, our margin of competitive advantage in international civil aviation is likely to be reduced. It is not impossible that our situation would remain favourable, but to act on that assumption would involve substantial risks if successful participation in international air commerce is essential to our military security." End of quote. Just think back to what I tried to get across in the early part of the paper, the politicization of civil aviation, the fact that you cannot look at civil aviation in isolation. It's connected with all kinds of things, including security. And I would argue that Pogue and others who thought like him saw a vital connection between the health of American civil aviation and its ability to have security in the air generally. In other words, civil aviation was inextricably entwined with American security. If American civil aviation floundered, it would compromise American security. And the bottom line for these people was that must never be allowed to happen. And if that means protecting American civil aviation, then so be it. Pogue believed it was. Pogue believed that it was the case that security and civil aviation were connected, and that civil aviation therefore had to be successful. And if that meant forms of protection, so be it. Pogue feared that in the medium term, lower foreign labour costs and possible government subsidies would eat away at the US's lead in civil aviation. Therefore, he was strongly committed to a form of protective bilateralism, but one that would nonetheless open up the world to a huge expansion of international civil aviation, mainly, of course, by US airlines, and one that would be more competitive and efficient. The only caveat was that US airlines must always have a leading role in that. President Franklin Roosevelt's attitude was different. In November 1943, he made it very clear what policy he favoured. And it's very clear from what I'm about to read you is that he very strongly favoured a multilateral agreement on the 5 freedoms. Some of what I'm about to read you are quotations from memoranda, others are my own words, but for the sake of the flow of it, I'm just going to read it out. Reading from a memorandum which he said he had himself prepared, Roosevelt gave these oral directives to his senior officials. He declared in favour of a very free exchange. That is, he wanted arrangements by which planes of one country could enter any other country for the purpose of discharging traffic of foreign origin and accepting foreign-bound traffic. And he knew what he was talking about. He clearly and precisely explained not only what later became commonly known as the 3rd and 4th freedoms, but also the slightly more complicated 5th freedom. Regarding the latter, he actually illustrated what he meant by explaining that a Canadian line operating to Jamaica should be allowed to pick up 5th freedom traffic in Buffalo for Jamaica, but not cabotage traffic for Miami. In other words, if you've got a Canadian airline flying and stopping at Buffalo and Miami on its way to, where is it? Jamaica, thank you. Then it should be allowed to pick up American passengers in Buffalo to take them on to Jamaica, but it should not be allowed to pick up American passengers in Buffalo for Miami, because that's cabotage. So Roosevelt clearly understood what the 5th freedom was all about. He was, in fact, drawing a picture of a general multilateral agreement that would automatically grant transit and stop and commercial outlets in terms of 3rd, 4th and 5th freedoms to all nations who entered into consort or who entered into an international agreement. This was the President's vision of freedom of the air. It was not Pogue's. Pogue's view was, and I quote, "With respect to the granting of commercial outlets, the right of any foreign airline to discharge and take on passengers and traffic, each nation must decide where its best interest lies. It would be quite unrealistic at this stage of the world's developments to assume that such commercial outlets should be more or less automatically granted to all comers." End of quote. But of course, commercial outlets being more or less granted automatically to all comers was precisely what a multilateral 5th freedom agreement would have done. Pogue was against that. This is what Pogue had to say about how he performed at the Chicago conference. And for me, it's a real insight into what he was up to at Chicago. First of all, I should say, when he was talking to me, he said Franklin Roosevelt didn't have a clue what he was doing in civil aviation. Not true. Roosevelt did know. It was just that what he wanted to do, Pogue didn't. At Chicago, according to Pogue's own words, regarding the air transport agreement, which incorporated the 5 freedoms, this is what he said. "I had to sort of play ball because I knew it would fail, but I put forward the transport agreement because that is what President Roosevelt commanded us to do." End of quote. Rather an odd way of putting it, isn't it? You know, I'm the de facto leader of the American delegation, and I was commanded to put forward the multilateral 5 freedoms agreement, but I knew it would fail. Damn right he did, because he had no intention that it would ever succeed. If you wish I can say more about that, I can give you more evidence for this line of interpretation, which I think is original, I think it is new, I think it overturns a lot of the conventional wisdom about why the Chicago conference went wrong. The British weren't the only bad guys at Chicago. So I would argue that Chicago, it was the Americans, as much, if not more so than the British, who scuppered the idea of a multilateral five freedoms agreement that would have automatically and reciprocally exchanged the five freedoms between all signatories. Regarding the dispute between the UK and the US over the fifth freedom rights, I would argue that the American delegation raised the bar every time the British made a concession, and they did so because they did not want to achieve an agreement that would have automatically exchanged the five freedoms between all signatories to the agreement. And that phrase, raising the bar, in other words, the argument here is that every time the British made a concession to American demands about the fifth freedom, the Americans raised the bar again and said, okay, thank you, and now we want you to do this. And then the British would concede again, and the Americans say, thank you, and now we would like you to do this. That doesn't come from me. That comes from a Canadian delegate at the conference. He was utterly angered by this, that the Americans torpedoed in new ideas as soon as the British had made a concession. He wasn't terribly fond of the way the British had behaved either, but on this, it seems he was clearly laying the blame at the feet of the Americans, that every time the British made a concession, the Americans would parachute in another proposal. They kept raising the bar. Okay, so what was actually achieved and what was still needed to enable the international civil aviation system to develop in the way that it has done? Well, the transit or two freedoms agreement was hugely important, as I've already argued. It opened the world to the possibility of realizing an effective worldwide international aviation passenger system. Chicago also publicized and raised the profile of the potential for civil aviation in such a way that the impasse on commercial rights could not last for long. In fact, 2 years later, in early 1946, on the island of Bermuda, British and American officials met again to revisit the challenge of a commercial regime. At this point, Britain was hugely vulnerable to US pressures because of its need for financial assistance. And the Anglo-American loan agreement, which had been negotiated and would provide Britain with over $3 billion worth of credit, had not yet been approved by the United States Congress. And that was used by the Americans at Bermuda to extract British agreement to the five freedoms. So what the Americans did at Bermuda was precisely what Pogue had always wanted. They managed to get a bilateral five freedoms agreement with Britain, dictated on their own terms. And by the way, this is not freedom of the skies stuff. This involved the control of pricing. The Americans actually, they suggested that they'd made a concession to the British at Bermuda by agreeing to a pricing regime that was run for many years by the International Air Transport Association, the IATA rate conferences. It wasn't a concession. As I said before, no senior American official wanted free pricing. They wanted controls because of the kind of predatory pricing that had gone on in the interwar period. And also the kind of predatory pricing that Pan Am practiced immediately after the war. And the Americans saw that as more dangerous to other American airlines than to foreign airlines. So the Americans wanted pricing. They made virtually no concessions at Bermuda. They got precisely what they wanted, a bilateral five freedoms agreement with the other most important player in international aviation in the world. They then used the Bermuda Agreement as a model.
This model would now be used by the USA to promote a liberal international civil aviation regime, but one with safeguards for the US, in that it could pick and choose with whom it would be liberal and with whom it would be more protectionist, because of the need to ensure the health and well-being of its own civil airlines, not just for commercial reasons, but also for political and security reasons. So Chicago created world open skies in terms of transit and technical stop, and Bermuda provided the model for how those open skies could be exploited. This combination of Chicago and the Bermuda Anglo-American Agreement provided the basis upon which the modern international civil aviation system has developed. Thank you.